elected president of the board in 2015 and served for 3 years on the board. And it's really an honor and a privilege that you're here. I know you're Oxford graduate as well. And I'm not saying this in terms of flattery, but I think a matter of fact. The Jewish community in the United Kingdom, like other parts of Europe and beyond, have become, I think, under greater pressure than perhaps in our lifetime. And Jonathan and his colleagues really, I think, stood up and serve as a fine example, I would argue, for the diaspora Jewish community on standing up strong and fighting various forms of hatred, and I think sets an example for other communities that face bigotry and hatred. So it's really an honor that you're here to join us.
Well, thank you very much. I feel a bit inadequate to be here because I'm no academic. I am a communal person working at the coalface, and I have no academic qualifications or pretensions whatsoever, but it is a pleasure to come back to my old university, although I have to say I was at a far less prestigious college than St. John's. So the perspective I'm going to give you is not an academic perspective, but I hope is a realistic perspective drawn from my own practical experience and indeed my interchanges with some of the personalities involved. And for those of you who are not aware, the Board of Deputies of British Jews is the British Jewish communal representative body. And I know a lot of you are historians, but I'm going to try a question on you. Would anyone like to guess when the Board of Deputies of British Jews was founded? And if you really know the answer, don't say. Any guesses? Anyone want to have a guess at when it might be founded? The British Jewish Community's representative body.
16th century.
Well, actually, it's a better guess than that. Yeah, it was actually 1760. 1760. So you've got to remember that Jews lived here, including in Oxford. If any of you have taken a walk down to the botanical gardens, hidden under a bush somewhere, at least it used to be, probably still is, you'll find a plaque which said here was the site of the synagogue before the expulsion of Jews from Britain in 1290. And from 1290, when, because of persecution, and probably more because Jews had a lot of debts which people didn't want to pay, including the king, Jews were expelled from this country, and they came back in about 1665, that sort of time, under Oliver Cromwell. So it took 100 years before Jews were confident enough to form an organisation to represent their rights. And this is a model which is very unusual around the world, that it's not a membership body, it is a representative body that every Jewish organisation of any size, 50 members or over, and any Jewish congregation of any size, Orthodox, Masorti, Reform, Liberal, and Jewish organisations, right-wing, left-wing, youth organisations, veterans organisations, cultural organisations, social action bodies, send a representative to the board who has to be democratically elected by their organisation. And the board therefore consists, in a sense, it is the British Jewish Parliament. So when I was its president and I stepped down 8 weeks ago, I could speak, I felt, fairly, as the representative of the community, and the board is easily the most representative body that our community has. And it's drawn from all sections of our community, and it meets no less than 8 times a year in plenary session. And if you're really keen, you can even watch the proceedings online, because they're streamed. And I was the mug who had to look after 300, sometimes quite fractious people, arguing about issues. But on one issue, there is no debate, there was no debate, and I'm confident there won't be a debate. And that is when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to speaking up, for our rights, our community will do it without fear or favour. Now, you're in Britain, and you've been discussing many things about anti-Semitism around the world. And my experience is mainly about this country, so I will focus on this country. Now, it won't surprise you to know that anti-Semitism in this country exists. I do not believe Britain is an anti-Semitic country, but I couldn't say it's a country that has no anti-Semitic people in it. I find me a country that doesn't have any anti-Semitic people. I'll go and live there tomorrow. And anti-Semitism in this country has come, of course, first of all, from one of the most traditional sources of anti-Semitism, the far right. But interestingly, right now, the far right, electorally, has no traction. It's a remarkable thing that our neighbour across the channel in France, anti-Semitism, or far right, is a potent political force, although it failed in the last election. I don't think you would call the far right in Britain a political force at all. I don't think it holds any, it hasn't got any seats in Parliament, never has had, and it doesn't have any seats, I think, even in local government elections. It has no political traction, but doesn't mean to say it's not there. It's asleep, semi-asleep. A far-right extremist murdered a member of Parliament, Joe Cox, if you remember, 2 or 3 years ago. And in his place where he lived, there was some anti-Semitic literature. No surprises there. But the far right is not a focus of our concern at the moment, because most of the anti-Semitism by no means comes from there. The second source of anti-Semitism has been and is increasing from some elements of Muslim communities in Britain. And I carefully emphasise some elements. And we don't have a British Muslim community, we have British Muslim communities. There are approximately 3 million Muslims in Britain, according to the census, which we think is pretty accurate, and that means Muslims make up 5% of the British population of just over 60 million. That's quite a significant percentage, although not nearly as large as in France, or in Belgium, or in Scandinavia, or in the Low Countries. And it's growing, of course, it's growing. And yet the scene with Muslim communities in Britain is very different from our neighbours on the continent, as of course many of you will know. British Muslims largely come from Pakistani antecedents. They are part of the legacy of the British Empire. And most British Muslims came here as long ago as the 1960s. Many of them, in fact, came from Uganda. They were refugees from Idi Amin when they were expelled from there. But many of them come from Kashmir. And today we have a much more mixed group where some come from Eritrea, Somalia, places like that, but we have relatively few from North Africa, and we have quite a large transient population from the Gulf. If you go to Marble Arch, that's very, very apparent, but they mainly come here to escape the desert weather. Last week, I think they may have rediscovered some of that desert weather, at least by my very English standards, when it was pretty hot. But the bulk of British Muslims, as I say, come from Pakistan. We sometimes joke within the Jewish community, but we're a very argumentative community and we're very fractious. Believe me, we have nothing on Muslims. British Muslims are very, very disunited. They don't have a board of deputies to speak for them, which in many ways is a real shame, because in many ways their voice is unrepresented, or at least to its full weight in this country. Now, because they're Pakistani, when they grew up, or their families grew up, their parents grew up, Israel was not a big part of their world picture because it was very far from Pakistan, and Jews were not a big part of their world picture because they didn't live with any. So you've got a completely different set of communities and values than the Muslims, for example, in France, who come from North Africa, who have some very clear views about Israel and about Jews. And we all know that those views aren't always very happy. But we do have, certainly, some elements of of the Muslim communities. Of course, today, they all receive their news the same way as you and I, on social media. They get a lot of subscription channels from Islamic countries. And I think we can confidently say that the great majority of British Muslims, while they don't care very much about the Middle East, they absolutely sympathise with the Palestinian cause. And with that comes a whole lot of websites and attitudes in editorials in Muslim newspapers that strongly take up the Palestinian cause, and some morph into anti-Semitism. And I dare say you have already studied, and many of you already are much more familiar with me than I am, that if you have particularly bigoted views about Israel, it almost always morphs into anti-Semitism. Maybe that's a controversial statement, but it's certainly our experience here in Britain. And it has been charted by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, which has excellent, scholarly, robust reports from polling and studies, that there is a much higher percentage of anti-Semitic prejudices amongst Muslims than amongst other sectors of society. And that won't come as any surprise to you. And yet, I spent a lot of my time invested in deepening Muslim-Jewish engagement in this country. Fortunately, and unlike my French colleagues, who when they go and ask to speak to Islamic leaders, they're actually told, we don't want to talk to you. Here, it's completely different. Now, I had to pick the people I was going to talk to quite carefully. I was not going to mosques where the leadership came from Muslim Brotherhood affiliates. That was not going to be very sensible for my reputation, and probably even worse for theirs. So I didn't go there. But most mosques and Islamic centres in this country don't have those affiliations. So I was able to go, and I did go, to large mosques, large congregations all over London, Leicester, 2 days in Bradford, Britain's largest Muslim community, something like 20-something% of the city, Leeds, the West Midlands, home to another very large Muslim communities, and Glasgow. And my pitch to them was, I'm a Jew. I'm a community leader. I'm a Zionist. And I'll tell you what Zionism means, and I did. And I said, ask me anything you like. I've heard it all before, and you can be frank with me, and let's have a debate. And I said to them, we can discuss Israel-Palestine. I've got no problems with that. I'm quite capable of having that debate. But I said to them, I couldn't really see the point. I was accepting that we were going to be on different sides of that discussion. And I said to them, I can't influence what happens in Israel any more than you can influence what happens with Israel's Arab neighbours. So why don't we just agree to disagree, park it, and let's talk about our common ground as British citizens. Let's talk about the fact that we have to defend halal and kosher, and we have to defend circumcision, Brit Milah, because it's very difficult to be a Jew in this country or a Muslim in this country without circumcision. Let's talk about defending our faith schools. Let's talk about what happens when you die and making sure you're buried quickly. And if that seems like a somewhat odd and outlandish argument, let me tell you it's just come before the courts in Britain. which ruled, by the way, in favour of a Jewish burial society when a coroner was being very difficult about facilitating a speedy burial. And let's talk about the role of faith in our very secular British society. And that resonated with them. But interestingly, when it came to the questions, and I said, so what's on your mind? The question I got asked almost every time, was why do Jews have so much influence? And some people actually came out with something a little bit more direct, which is another way of looking at the same thing, which is, it can't be explained by your numbers because you're much smaller than our communities. You're a tenth of the size, and yet you seem to have 100 times more influence. And therefore, but of course you and I know it's not a therefore at all, it's a complete non sequitur, there must be some sort of conspiracy. You must be running things behind the scenes. And polling has shown, and my experience supports it, about 40 to 50% of Muslims, even those who were born in this country, whose parents were born in this country, they believe to a greater or lesser extent the notion that Jews have so much influence and that it cannot be explained by anything rational. So I did my best to counter it and say, actually, it's quite simple. Jews have played an integral part in the life of this country. We have invested in civic society, in cultural matters. Eventually you get recognised, you might get an award from the Queen, you might end up in a House of Lords. And I said, that's what you could do. It's very simple. There's no malign conspiracy. In fact, if there is a conspiracy, I joked with them, someone probably would have told me about it at some stage, but nobody ever has. Some people thought I was just a silly joke and I was a marvellous actor, all the rest of it. But this is a battle. And why do I mention it? I mention it because I'm worried. I'm worried that a large section of young British Muslims are actually more religious than their parents and less integrated than their parents. And you could say that happens to some extent in the Jewish community as well. And to an extent that would be true. But I'm worried that because of social media, because of the impact of very exciting and inspirational views about the Ummah and the world's Muslim communities, and they're rediscovering their roots, and it's, everyone should be Muslim eventually, and how influential they could be if they applied themselves correctly. I'm worried that some of the young people in our British Muslim communities do not feel as fully acculturated to British life as they should do. And I said to them, please don't think I'm talking about losing sight of your Muslim values. I said, if you want to look at a community that has not lost sight of its values, its religious values, that is intent on religion, on tradition or cultural association and being British and having no conflict between them, look at the Jewish community. No one could say we've lost sight of our cultural values and we're very identifiable as a minority. And you can exist here as a God-fearing Muslim as you want and also embrace British values. But to large sections of our British Muslim communities, the word British values, the term British values actually is an offensive term. They're not sure about it. And I don't think they are completely on the path to acculturation. So I ask myself, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, in 30 years' time, because I don't think we're going to know for 20 or 30 years, where will British Muslims be if they are moving further down the path of integration? Fine. But what if they're not? You could be looking at well over double their percentage of the population now, probably triple, 15%, maybe more. And if they are a part of British society that doesn't feel very British, Where is our society going to go? And to me, that is actually the biggest cloud on the horizon for a future of Jews in this country. And there were some early warning signs during the Gaza campaign. You know, generally Britain does not embrace extreme political philosophies, generally. But there are usually, when there's an upsurge in anti-Semitism, there's a trigger event. And the main trigger event is violence in the Middle East. And 4 years ago in the Gaza campaign, we had mass rallies in the streets of London and around this country, Manchester and big cities. They were not wholly, but considerably organised by Muslim bodies of one sort or another. Muslims were very distinctive as a large part of the crowd. We had over 100,000 people marching through London. And until the organisers, well, we told the organisers, and the organisers realised it was not doing their reputation any good, some people were carrying banners saying Hitler was right. This was about Gaza. And there were many people who were saying to the media things that were nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with Gaza, but everything to do with anti-Semitism, classical anti-Semitism. So this is an issue which will continue to energise them, and they're sufficiently large in numbers that I'm worried for the future about their sense of balance and also acculturation here. But in the main, they're not extremists, and the battle is there to be fought. So that is the next source of anti-Semitism in this country. And so now I have to come to what I know you're all expecting me to come to, and that is the anti-Semitism, not of the far right, but this time of the far left. And since the advent of a political figure from the far left, by utter mismanagement of the Labour Party affairs, since the advent of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the opposition in 2015, we have seen in this country, in a way that is unprecedented in my lifetime, a discourse that is rampant across social media, where, of course, something can go viral with one click, of not only very blatantly, I would say, bigoted anti-Israel discourse, but it has absolutely morphed into anti-Semitism. And you can see it in so many places, not only on social media. If you ask Labour members of Parliament, not only Jewish ones, but anyone who has expressed support for the Jewish community, and particularly the Labour members of Parliament who are women and Jewish, like Luciana Berger and Louise Ellman in Liverpool, and Ruth Smith in Stoke, and others, John Mann, a very courageous non-Jewish member of Parliament from a mining constituency in Nottinghamshire, and Wes Streeting in Ilford, and I could name you many others. They get, when they go to their own constituency Labour Party meetings, a level of abuse and viciousness that is grotesquely anti-Semitic, not impliedly, explicitly anti-Semitic. And the stuff on social media is so bad I couldn't even repeat it in polite company. The threats, the nature of the threats, the abuse, the crudeness, and all of them have had to take on elaborate security precautions for their own protection. And in John Mann's case, even his daughters, family, have been threatened with physical abuse just because of who their father is. So let no one ask, give me proof of anti-Semitism. You don't have to look very far. And because Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of the opposition, that discourse has now moved to the centre of our political life, where once upon a time you could have said, well, it's confined to the extremes, and it's not important, because for 30 years Jeremy Corbyn was a nobody. He was an outlier who distinguished himself by defying his leaders in the Labour Party countless times over 30 years. So you could dismiss him as a, yeah, you know, of course he would say that. But now he's the leader of the opposition. And bearing in mind that our government has now been, the Conservative administration has been the government, by the time the next general election, if they last that long, they'll have been in government for 12 years. And in how many democratic countries, multi-party system countries like ours, do administrations last longer than 12 years? By the end of 12 years, people want change. They'll do almost anything for change, even voting for people they don't have very much confidence in. Because it's not a case of the opposition winning the election, it's a case of the government losing it. And therefore, there is a real prospect of a far-left leader, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn, who will be 73 at the time of the next general election, or whether it's someone else close to him, like John McDonnell, whose views are, frankly, just as bad. There's a very good chance of a leader of a far-left politician becoming the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Is Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semitic? You could debate this uphill and down dale. It's the question I'm most frequently asked. My personal view, not always accepted by my community, is that he doesn't think he's anti-Semitic. And I'm not even sure he really is anti-Semitic, but I don't think it matters. What there is no doubt about is that he has a blind spot towards anti-Semitism and a reluctance to confront it directly and address it effectively. Why? Because it's his political soulmates. People like Ken Livingstone. It took the Labour Party 2 years, and then they gave Ken Livingstone a slap on the wrist. And only when it looked like that he would be taken to a proper disciplinary tribunal did he resign. And Jeremy Corbyn said it was a sad day. Even though his deputy leader, Tom Watson, said it wasn't a sad day, people like Ken Livingstone should have no place in the Labour Party. And Jeremy Corbyn, right to this day, need I, anyone who's read the Times this morning, you'll have seen the stories are happening every day, but I'll give you the latest one just because it could hardly be more current. At a meeting of Labour's ruling body, the National Executive Committee, within the last few days, a far-left supporter called John Wilsman, who was recorded, and if you go onto the Jewish Chronicle website, you can hear the recording. Apparently he spoke up, I think he was even standing up because he lost his temper, at the National Executive and shouted. It was a rant. I can't stand this talk of anti-Semitism. How many of you in this room have ever seen it, he said. He was a bit shocked when people put up their hands. He said, I can't stand the stories of these rabbis writing letters. I don't believe it's a smear. And the Jewish community is all, I think his phrase was, fanatical Trump supporters. Yeah. Right? This is a usual sort of extremist tactic, smear the people against you and don't deal with their concrete problems. And while he's now apologised, and very quickly Labour said, well, we won't have any disciplinary issues against him, as has been widely reported today, Jeremy Corbyn sat there as chairman of the meeting and he was silent. Other people protested and Jeremy Corbyn was silent. Now, if any of us had been chairing a meeting where someone had stood up and said these things, I would have felt that we would have stopped them and said, do you mind? This is not the time or the place or the manner in which we should be spoken to like this. And this is just the latest example. The recent publicity in which the Jewish community was pushed beyond the levels of endurance. Our community normally does not seek to take on the political forces of the day, but although we're a confident community, but we rose to what we regarded was a challenge we could not shirk. When it became known that Jeremy Corbyn had supported a mural, the infamous mural of anti-Semitic stereotypes, you know the sort of things, hook nose, people carrying bundles of money. Some of you will be familiar with this if you've studied the Nazi literature. And they were playing with their money on a sort of board game like Monopoly, and the board was on the backs of kneeling, naked, poor people. Right? So grotesquely anti-Semitic cartoon, nothing to do with Israel. And when it came out, it was a mural painted on a wall in East London, and immediately there were calls for it to be taken down. Jeremy Corbyn said, no, I don't think it should be taken down. He was recorded. Now, this was before he became the leader of the opposition, but he was challenged about it. So lots of politicians have got things in their past, and you would expect them to say, that was then. I don't recognise those views in me now. I completely reject them, and I'm sorry. Oh, not Jeremy Corbyn. When challenged, he said, well, I felt it was right in the interests of free speech. Really? Free speech? Free speech extends to anti-Semitism. When he was challenged about that, he said, well, to be honest, I didn't really notice it. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has gone. There was the Passover Seder, which the mock Seder by a very left-wing group, which satirises Judaism. Jeremy Corbyn went to that. Apparently, when my name was called out, everyone jeered, and I don't mind that at all. That's a badge of honour for me. And they parodied Jewish songs around the Passover Seder, and they were so obscene, and they were also, F the Queen, and especially F Prince Philip, and all this. And Jeremy Corbyn said, I didn't hear any of it. He always doesn't hear anything, and he doesn't do anything, and he only ever does something when there's such a public furore that he's told he has no alternative. So this is what our community is faced with at the moment, but not just our community. Not just our community. You know well that Jews are like the canary in the mine. If there's anti-Semitism that is allowed to persist in society, it says something very serious about the state of that society. I've just seen what Elie Wiesel says. It might start with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. Not just anti-Semitism, but ugly racism and all sorts of other things. And so we have no choice, and we are willing to fight this pernicious form of racism that is not what I would regard as true Labour Party ideals. Labour has been taken over by a far left faction. And that is why you are witnessing what we currently see as effectively a civil war inside the Labour Party. Tom Watson, the deputy leader, tweeted yesterday about this man who, with the rant, he is a loudmouth bully, he disgusts me. This is the deputy leader of the party talking about someone in his own National Executive Committee. And Jeremy Corbyn so far, characteristically, has remained mute. So it's a civil war. But what Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him are trying...
Without civility.
What the Jeremy Corbyn is trying to do with the party at the moment is do what a far left group wants to do, and that is take all the levers of power and marginalise anyone who opposes. And they're achieving it. So already we've got a state of affairs whereby the Labour Party is not run by Labour members of Parliament. The reason Jeremy Corbyn was elected is that he's elected by the members of the party who only had to pay £3 to become members of the party. And the Labour MPs do not support Jeremy Corbyn in the main. They don't support him, but they're stuck with him, and most of them oppose him. So we're in for this challenge for the long term, until Labour can rediscover what I believe to be its true social democratic and tolerant backgrounds and its opposition to racism. And right now, I'm sorry to tell you, Labour is the home of too much racism by this far left grouping that is very active on social media, that has a ideological reference points, and this is the trouble, and this is where I will end, ideological reference points of extremists are fixed. They don't want to challenge them, and they can't challenge them, because otherwise they wouldn't be extremists. They would be rationalists. And I don't believe you can be an extremist and rational at the same time, because you have to be able to challenge. And I've tried debating with Jeremy Corbyn, and it's very difficult. He can't debate, doesn't debate. And it's a problem. And these ideological reference points are very dangerous. They are hostile to the sort of Western liberal democratic values that we're used to, and they certainly pose a threat to our community. And we know it, and we see it, and we will fight it till the very end. And I feel ashamed, frankly. I feel ashamed in front of you, in my own country, that has long been known for its sense of fairness and tolerance and understanding, where racists are rightly viewed as objectionable. I firmly believe that if you substitute the word black for Jew in this debate, people would be astonished and horrified that you could do these things. You know, this is argument going on about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. I could give you so many examples, there are so many, but I've used up my time. And I'm also very grateful to you for listening to me, and I will answer any questions, and I'm also very conscious that only I stand between you and your dinner. So, anyway, that's where I am. Thank you.
So, you want to just take the questions?
Sure, I'll take the questions. Yes.
Yes. Thank you for your work and for standing up. I think it's amazing. But I have a couple questions too, if I may. You're a barrister, and so you deal in legal issues, and you talked about the fight and putting pressure. In America, for instance, it's been a very difficult battle in terms of free speech and curbing free speech. I don't know the laws here. I'd like if you could please address that. And the second is you talked about integration as being a factor for the young radicalization among the youth in the Muslim community. But what exactly does Israel have to do with the integration of British youth?
Answering the second question first, if you are within this particular sort of Muslim bubble, Israel has a lot to do with it. Israel is a proxy or a protege of the United States. Israel is a protege of Western liberal democracies. And Israel can be cast, if you so wish, as an oppressor, as an occupier, as a colonialist. You can even cast Israel as apartheid. I'm not doing any of these, but if that's the narrative you want, and Israel becomes a proxy for all the things you hate about the West, and all these stories of how Western armies invade Muslim countries and abuse their women and all this sort of thing, well, Israel is in a fight with Muslim countries and Gaza on its borders. So Israel figures very largely because for them it symbolizes everything that they regard as wrong. And your first question, remind me, your first question was about... yes. It's very interesting. Actually, we have much more stringent laws about free speech here than you have in the United States. So, I mean, I was shocked beyond measure when I heard what they were chanting in Charlottesville recently. You could not do that without being arrested in this country. But it doesn't touch, or it might touch, but it doesn't always touch some of the stuff on social media, a lot of which is left, of course, anonymously. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn and people around him are very careful not to say anything that would breach the law. But the laws, we have a law about incitement to race hatred. And that's the main legal weapon. But calling Israel an apartheid country would not count as incitement to race hatred, nor should it, by the way. I believe in free speech. I believe in free speech short of incitement to violence or hatred. And a lot of the discourse would not cross a criminal law boundary, but that doesn't make it any less objectionable. Okay? Yes, you, sir.
Thanks a lot for your very fascinating talk. I'm interested in this transfer when it comes to Israel hatred from Muslim communities, certain Muslim communities, into the left. That means Israel hatred that has several ingredients also from classical anti-Semitism, and how this is actually expressed in the left or in left liberal till far left milieux in a socially accepted way. So you mentioned several times the social media and what kind of characteristics you could find so that actually people are able to say that what they could grasp from other like Muslim communities.
Well, my honest answer is I wish I knew. Let me give you an example. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign is the main lobby group for Palestinian causes. All right? Well, look at its website. Look at the comments. Right? And you will see, and I'm not accusing the PSC of anti-Semitism, not for one moment. I don't happen to like it, and by the way, its view appears to be, but they're very coy about it, the dismantling of the State of Israel, because their logo puts Palestine where we know as Israel and the West Bank. So impliedly, they don't disagree with the two-state solution. But if you look at the comments on a website, so they had a huge internal battle about 2 or 3 years ago, which has weakened them, about the presence of anti-Semites in them, who they wanted to throw out, and eventually some were thrown out. But 20% of the members voted against them throwing out. And these were people who were not talking about anti-Semitism. I'll give you another example. Character in this country. He doesn't deserve any publicity because he's nobody. He's called Stephen Sizer. He was a Church of England minister who resigned his ministry. He was somewhat disgraced by being involved in so many problematic statements about Israel and verging into anti-Semitism that the board, and I led this, we instituted a church disciplinary process against him, which led to me talking to 2 of his bishops. Right? It's an interesting job being leader of the Jewish community in this country. You get to talk with bishops who are often fantastic people. And Stephen Sizer, very, very anti-Israel. His idea of a summer camp is not to go to Oxford, but to go to one of those things in the West Bank, what's it called, some really objectionable festival of something. Fine. You know what? That's his view. I haven't got a problem with it. I don't agree with it. Suddenly on his website, you started to see things which have nothing to do with Israel. He started to poke derision at Jews in Stamford Hill, a very orthodox area of northeast London, having cars, a group called Shomrim, for their own protection against anti-Semitic attack. How does a man who hates Israel suddenly post these things on his website? Nothing to do with Israel. In fact, ironically, the people he was deriding were probably anti-Zionists. That's another matter. All right? I wish I knew the answer, and the answer, I believe, the closest I can come to it, is that if you're really bigoted about Israel, you go on websites, and we all go on websites that reflect our own views, right? Because that's what we do. We don't look for aggravation every single day by reading a website that you disagree with unless you have an academic interest in it. Unfortunately, some of the most virulently anti-Israel websites are full of anti-Semitism. Truth is, go on Comment is Free in The Guardian and look at the comments. You'll very quickly, you don't have to go very far down, on discussion about anti-Semitism, you'll find anti-Semitic comments. But you'll understand it much better than I do because you're academic and I'm not. You and then this gentleman. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions for you from the first portion of your talk. But before that, I just wanted to say I appreciate you coming here with so much relevant information about ongoing issues as far as anti-Semitism. So my first question is, were you the only member of the British Jewish community able to go to the mosque and congregations to speak with the British Muslim community? And my second question is, what are some things the British Jewish community can do to mend the relationship between the British Muslim community and to help integrate them into British culture?
Thank you. Good question. No, I'm not the only person. In fact, what I was doing was building on very long established, in many cases, local relationships between synagogues and mosques, indeed between churches and mosques as well. So there's some fantastic interfaith initiatives in places up and down this country where Jews and Muslims have long fought the battle together against intolerance in society. When a mosque was firebombed in Muswell Hill a couple of years ago, the synagogue provided its hall for the services of the mosque. I'll tell you another story. In 2014, when there was a lot of concern in the Jewish community about Muslim views, there's a small Jewish community in Leicester. And the rabbi was going to set off for synagogue on Friday night, the Sabbath. And he opened his front door and he was alarmed to see 6 people in Islamic dress. And he thought they had come to do him harm. And they said, Rabbi, we want you to know we are upset about some of the talk in our community, and we have come to accompany you in safety to the synagogue to tell our community that we are friends. All right, that was, now, there have been these gestures everywhere, so I'm not the only person who can do it, and we absolutely have to encourage the strongest possible interfaith work around our country. One of the problems is that not many Jews live in some areas where there are large numbers of Muslims. So in Bradford, for example, Britain's largest Muslim community, there's one small synagogue with mainly elderly people. So Jews and Muslims don't get to mix that much, which is why I wanted to try and encourage more of it.
Thank you, Mr. Arkush. Thank you, first of all, for your wonderful presentation. It took me backward and forward in so many ways. I studied here at Oxford with Charles and some others almost 30 years ago, and my area dealt with race, immigration, Britain, the United States, the legal issues that you touched upon in so many meaningful ways. And it's interesting because even though you hit on a lot of things that mattered academically to me, perhaps the most powerful thing, I'm going to try to keep my composure when I say this, was to hear your comment about shame. Because I felt the same way, and many Americans feel tremendous shame. So I have kind of a layered question, and forgive me, it's not particularly Oxonian. And I have difficulty between these sections between academic work and advocacy. That's just as a footnote. But so I just want to ask you a couple of things. One, what do you do? Or what do those like you do for moments of renewal in times like these? What do you do for purposes of renewal? I say that because we have young people here who are Wiesdale King's College, and we want them to be renewed because they will be here longer than we.
Yeah.
So that's my first part.
Thank you.
My second part is just a minor point, and it deals with free speech, which is another area of my focus academically. So I just want to ask about Speaker's Corner. Is it flooded now?
Is it?
Is it being flooded by people? Because it seems like that's that one safe space where you can say some unsafe things.
Yeah, well, Speaker's Corner, I never go there. It's where someone literally stands on a soapbox and rants. And you get all sorts of people there. In a way, it's a sort of safety valve, I guess, because I can't believe many of us would actually want to go to Speaker's Corner and, have a lecture or a rant about our thing, because what's the point? But it's a very British thing. And I'm all in favour of it, whatever people say there. I mean, obviously they should stick within the law. I dare say lots of people say things that are completely across the criminal law, but nobody takes any notice. And doubt not many people go and listen to them either. So, but the first part of the question was a very significant question. Yeah, look, I've got kids in this country. I'm worried about the future. I'm a Brit. My grandfather emigrated to this country in 1907. My grandfather fought on one side in the First World War, and my father was a decorated soldier in the Second World War. And I went to public school in Oxford, and I'm at the bar. I'm British. I will never be anything other than British. I could go and live in New Zealand tomorrow, or Australia, or Israel. But I'm always be a Brit. You can take me out of Britain, but you can't take the Brit out of me. And I care passionately about the future of a country like ours, about Britain, which I'm part of, and every country that is a country of liberal values, like the United States or European countries, or Western, part of the Western family. And any country, east, west, north or south, that cares about rights. So we should care. It's Britain today, but it might be another country tomorrow. I comfort myself by saying that I don't know what the next general election will bring. I don't know. If it does bring an extremist ideology of the far left, like we are seeing now running Labour, I worry that our society in Britain will be in for a number of very rough years. I worry that our community, which has always stood up for human rights and tolerance and listening to minorities, and for things that our community cares about, like addressing Holocaust denial, which is a matter which I think goes beyond the interests of the Jewish community, will not be listened to. I think when you go and see the Community Security Trust on a couple of days from now, the people you speak to you, who I know well, who I respect hugely, will be saying the same things. They will be worried. They're worried about the physical security of our community. And I'm worried about that too. And I think we'll be in for a number of rough years. I'm quite worried, actually, about the economic proposals of this far-left administration, because they've been tried before and they've failed. That goes well beyond the confines of the Jewish community. So to comfort myself, I say, well, you know what? We've survived worse and we'll survive it. And we're not shy and we won't be shy. And let me be clear about this. While some people will leave this country, and some Jewish people will leave this country, and they've got Israel to go to, and perhaps some will go elsewhere, I'm absolutely sure most will remain, because the truth is it's a very big thing to leave a country and go elsewhere. And it would have to be extremely bad. I mean, France is not a great country at the moment for Jews, but most Jews live in France and they batten down the hatches, as we would say, and they get on with it. And we will, and it will pass. But in a way, that's not the point. What I take most comfort from is the views of decent people who I meet in my professional life, in my communal life, who are not Jewish. I go on holiday in an area of the north of England with mountains, about as far away from the sort of metropolitan, chattering classes as you could, and I speak to farmers, and they've said the same to me as the person who reads The Guardian and The Times in London. They are looking at Labour, they are reading about Labour, and they don't like the dark, seamy side of what they're reading about, and they think it's a disgrace to Britain. And they've said to me, what we did for the Jewish community, standing up for our rights, has an impact far beyond the Jewish community. And please keep doing it. That's what renews me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I had two questions, but you just answered the first question, which was about how people in the community and whether or not they won't vote for Labour under the circumstances specifically around anti-Semitism, but I think you kind of answered that. The second question that I wanted to ask is about the way in which the Jewish Voice for Labour, I'm not sure if that's the right organisation, but certainly in South Africa we've seen Jews being placed at the forefront in South Africa in PBS to prevent allegations of anti-Semitism. And there seems to be a similar circumstance happening here, and your views on that.
Yeah. Well, to answer the first bit of what you said, the trust between Labour, which was strongly connected with the Jewish community in much the same way as Jews in America largely voted Democrat, it was sort of considered an almost given, that's broken. Very few Jews at the moment will vote Labour. But the problem is far beyond the Jewish community, as we've seen. We saw it in the local government elections in April. The people who come together in what's known as Jewish Voices for Labour that may have 100 members. So let's keep this in perspective, please. The funny thing is they don't really understand that they are amongst the most traditional Jews that you could be. Because in every society, there's always a group of people, and probably in every community, who define themselves by opposition to the community. They feel proud of themselves and, bully for them. I don't really think they're thinking about, where their kids are going to end up or, what they're saying about Jewish history. But they're doing a very traditional thing, which is we shall define ourselves by standing outside any sort of Jewish communal structures. They have put themselves outside the community deliberately and defiantly, because that's their view, and they're welcome to it. But when it comes to joining up with anti-Semites, then I asked myself, are they not placing their ideology before their, when they use their brains? They're putting their hearts before their brains. I mean, they are effectively useful idiots, as a phrase you will be familiar with. And they were formed specifically to give cover to Jeremy Corbyn, and their raison d'etre is deny there's any anti-Semitism. They don't surprise me. I mean, probably if they didn't exist, you'd have to invent them. But frankly, they're risible. They are a joke. When it came to our Enough is Enough demonstration on March the 26th, they had their counter-demonstration. Well, we called it at a few hours' notice. We didn't even call it a demonstration. 2,000 people came up. There were about 24 of them. But of course, the BBC, in order to indicate fairness, interviewed their spokesman and interviewed our spokesman. So you would have thought that actually it was an equal force. Don't be fooled. There were a couple of dozen of them, even at their Judas Seders, the same sort of group of people, people who I think their Jewishness and certainly their sense of history perhaps could do with a little bit of brushing up, coming to a summer scheme like this. We're talking of, 50 people, 60 people. I mean, come on. We actually, I really want to thank Jeremy Corbyn. He's the only person I could have imagined who could have got 68 British rabbis from Haredim in Stamford Hill to lady liberal rabbis. These people wouldn't talk to each other in a million years. And they all wrote the same joint letter. Only Jeremy Corbyn has succeeded in uniting our community from all wings of the community. And I thank Jeremy Corbyn for that. He's really done us a great service. But these people, they defiantly stand outside, but let's not overestimate their importance. They're a tiny number, and everyone's seen through them. Yeah.
Hi, I just want to say, as a former Brit, and I think I'm the only former Brit in this crowd, I don't know the others, that it's such an honour for me to have Jonathan with us. I knew Jonathan when I was in my community living here, and I feel extremely proud that Jonathan is leading the Jewish community here for us. If it's okay, I have two questions. The first is, could you say something about the Muslim contingent within the Labour Party, just in terms of your insights and how we should view that? And secondly, the level of fear or concern of British Jewish students on university campuses.
Yeah. So, of course, some people say, well, what Corbyn is doing is that he's rather cunning, because what he's trying to do is to energise the Muslim vote. I'm not convinced, actually, there is that sort of thinking. And even if there was, I don't think it's actually likely to succeed, because many British Muslims are middle class or aspirational middle class. And actually, they're just as able to see through Jeremy Corbyn and the bleakness of the racism. And they're not stupid. They know that anti-Semitic hostility could also turn into anti-Muslim hostility. And there is already a lot of anti-Muslim hatred in this country. Already a lot. And Jews and Muslims have stood strongly against it. And the CST, who you're going to see, actually helped to establish the Muslim version of it, which is called Tell Mama. Right? Now, it is true that there will be some amongst Muslim communities who actually quite like the anti-Semitism, and it will give them a reason to vote Labour. But I don't think it is that many. And in any event, okay, Muslims make up 5% of this country. That means 95% of this country is not Muslim. So if there was a tactic, but I don't think there is, to win the Muslim vote, well, I don't think it's particularly going to work. And even if it did, I don't think it's particularly significant. I'm more concerned about the people who are voting for Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn supporters, interestingly enough, are mainly university educated. They're not in the main blue-collar workers, which is an interesting, field for some thought, for some study. About universities, when you're not living in this country, you read the things that are reported, perhaps in Israel, where you come from, and you read all the bad stuff. So if there's some incident, we've had 2 or 3 bad incidents at leading London universities in the last 3 years, 2 at King's College London, 1 at University College London, both campuses very popular with Jewish students, and Action Palestine, or bodies like them, they got a bit overexcited and they tried to storm a meeting where an Israeli was speaking. As it happened, it was an Israeli who was anti the Israeli government, gay, left-wing, fiercely anti-occupation. So the Action Palestine guys did sort of get the wrong target. The Israeli government, the Israeli ambassador spoke the week before and nobody turned up. So, but the reality is 170 plus events in the last academic year about Israel, 3 were disrupted. All right? So you need to keep it in perspective. When I was, the last year in which I led the community, more pro-BDS resolutions failed than passed. And they failed at places with had almost no Jewish students, right? So we have, and we're seeing a virulence of BDS on campuses in the United States that I feel very, very concerned about. It's very carefully packaged in the United States. And the truth is, it's symbolic as well. If a student body decides it wants the union to boycott Israel, well, the union doesn't have any connections with Israel, and it doesn't control the university's academic links abroad. In fact, I'm fond of asking this question: how many boycotts of Israeli academic institutions are there at British universities? Anyone want to guess? The answer is 0. There are 6, I believe, in the United States at the moment. It would, in fact, be against English law equalities legislation, but I think there's another reason. That's I think there is no appetite for it amongst our campuses. So when you do read something, remember all the bandwidth is that it's not. Now, having said that, a lot of our British students are extremely challenged. They feel under threat because sometimes the Palestinian lobby is very vocal and very in your face. And sometimes they demonstrate outside Israel Society or Jewish Society meetings, and students like to express themselves in quite strong ways, and it can be very unpleasant. But I think most Jewish students, and including my children, and including me when I was here, feel it was part of the challenges of university, and we've tried to bring up our kids to have enough understanding of the issues to debate them, and they just regard it as part and parcel of university life. But my kids said to me, when I became vice president of the community, they said, "Dad, please don't go out there and say to people we're having a terrible time. The truth is we're having a great time at university, and this is just one of the negative bits that we have to deal with, and deal with it we will." And I think that was, the more I learned in my role, the more I felt that was actually quite fair. So there are some bad bits, but in the main, we're doing okay. Yes.
How does Brexit affect the situation you described? And is there any anger underneath that is basically thrown at the faces of Jews?
The answer to your second question is no. I think the Jewish community was as split as the rest of the British population about Brexit. My anecdotal, I stress anecdotal, impression from talking to people is that most British Jews voted Remain for the sort of, because we would more naturally feel that a partnership with other countries is better than going it alone. And I think some of us were worried by some of the more xenophobic aspects of the Brexit campaign. But I don't think it actually, in reality, I don't think it's really an issue for Jews. I think it's an issue for the country. Being strictly partisan, in terms of shechita is protected under European legislation. If we have a Brexit, that legislation will need to be carried through into British legislation. And I dare say that there will be some who oppose it in Parliament. In terms of Brit Milah, circumcision, I would say probably we're better out, because there's a growing body of opposition within the European Parliament and European countries to circumcision. By the way, we have the same interests of Muslims on both these issues. So my colleagues from countries outside saying they would much prefer Britain to stay in because they saw Britain as a source of moderation and good sense within the European Parliament. And if we're outside, we'll lose that. But that's an issue just for Jews. But basically, not an issue for our community specifically. Yes?
Great Britain did a lot of work, and they have adopted the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Alliance.
First country to adopt it,
yes,
yeah.
And opened the road for that to all another European countries.
Yes.
To the world. So my first question is did the British jury make a lot of efforts for that, or the Parliament was initially open for those initiatives? And the second question is how the adoption of our definition influenced the situation concerned anti-Semitism in Great Britain.
Right, well, that's an extremely important point. First is that British Jews were extremely active in encouraging our civil society, government first, to adopt the IRA definition. And it was the culmination of years of persuasive efforts, and I thought it showed our communities its best. Listen, the way our community works, this is the sort of watchword for all Jewish communities in many ways. We're a small community. We don't have many votes. At 0.5%, we are 0.5% of the British population. 300,000 Jews, 63 million people is less than 0.5%. So we haven't got much political power. So the only way a small Jewish community can protect itself and guard its values and traditions in a much larger society is by winning the arguments on their merits. That's essentially the work of the Board of Deputies. Small staff of about a dozen, closely working with opinion formers, local government, national government, civil servants, journalists, all sorts of organisations, NGOs and civil society to win the argument. Because we believe we've got right, shechita is very controversial. Brit Milah is pretty controversial, but if you argue the case on its merits, you can win the argument on its merits. And that's what we tried to do, and that was the same with IRA. But the significance of IRA, to answer the last part of your question, is enormous. Why? Well, first of all, the effect of the British government adopting it was that immediately the Labour Party adopted it. They've now covered that up. But it was either the National Executive Committee or a subcommittee said that the Labour was adopting it. They've now managed to not show us the documents, but at the time, they were quite clear that it was adopted. The Liberal Democrats, the Scottish National Parties, all the major political parties adopted it. The Welsh government, left-wing government. The Scottish government, which is a very left-wing government, adopted it. Now we're at about 126 local authorities have adopted it. A whole load of universities have adopted it, and some are still adopting it. Why is it important? It's an internationally recognised working definition. It's not cast in stone, it's only a working definition, but it has, it's very carefully nuanced. It makes it absolutely clear, which is why I said to Jeremy Corbyn, absolutely clear that criticism of Israel is not viewed as anti-Semitism of itself. And the examples are only examples of what might be anti-Semitic in context. So there's plenty of room for discussion there, which is why I find it baffling that Labour are tearing itself apart over this particular issue. But the importance of the definition cannot be, in my view, cannot be overstated. I would encourage every country to adopt it because it's an internationally recognised set of behaviours and values which in context could cross the line into anti-Semitism, and it therefore is helpful. And it's a very important working tool, which I think is entirely fit for purpose. And let me be clear, this is not some sort of Jewish construct. This is an intergovernmental definition between the members of IRA. I think it's 28 governments. And I hope it will continue to be found to be useful and be adopted by more and more places. And the fact that we have it here, I mean, the fact that Labour are fighting so hard not to do it, I think tells you something. They actually want to continue to be able to have the discourse that says a British Jew may be more loyal to Israel than loyal to the United Kingdom. Madness, but there it is. They want to be able to continue to say that you can apply Nazi imagery to Israel. They want to be able to do that. They want to continue to be able to say that Israel is a racist endeavour. I've just quoted 3 of the examples which Labour rejected or put in a different section, didn't say they were anti-Semitic. There you have the problem.
We have about 10 minutes left.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have 2 questions. First is that you mentioned in your speech, young UK Muslims are the second generation, third generation, I suppose, are more religious but less integrated. And if I catch you correctly, you also said so it is with the young Jewish communities. So I got very wondering about this social phenomenon because as I can see from the diaspora Chinese, the second generation totally less Chinese and much more integrated. So do you have any explanations for the situation in UK? And my second question is that, because you also mentioned that you are confronted by many people with the same question, why the Jews have so much influence? So I want to know, how would you answer the question? And you mentioned too that concerning anti-Semitism in UK, your community are without fear or favor. And because we have the previous lectures, and I don't know that in UK, as you are one of the board of the Jewish community here, is there anything that you are not allowed to say, or there's some PC line that you are not allowed to touch? If there's something like this, I really want to know about that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I said some young Muslims were less well integrated, some Jews are less well integrated, and I think the reasons are common actually. When you have a generation that immigrates, it wants to assimilate into society. We certainly had with the Jewish community. I mean, my father, who came from an Orthodox Jewish background, whose own father was a Jewish minister, my father's Jewish education was, frankly, badly lacking. I think you'd probably say this about his generation in the United States and many countries where Jews immigrated. Why? His parents were more concerned about making a living and having a roof over their heads, which took time, and they just, you know, things like Jewish education, which would have been axiomatic in Poland, where he'd come from, just fell by the wayside. And I think there's been a certain reaction to that, because the community understood that if you don't perpetuate your values to your children, you're gone. You've lost them, right? We would have disappeared. So we started to build Jewish schools and things like that. And I think there's a certain amount of feeling like that in Muslim communities too. And the advent of social media, never underestimate the advent of social media. I think young Muslims were growing up and they were receiving messages from Islamic countries that said, you know, the West is bad, the West is diluting our values, you've got to fight back against it. And I think some felt, you know, that they reacted, I think, wrongly if they went towards a more Islamist view, as opposed to just becoming more traditionally religious. But to some extent that happened. You could look at lots of cases where people who are now very, wear Islamic dress. You see hijabs now in London. When I was growing up, you'd never see a hijab. It was just basically unknown. And the people who wear hijabs are not recent immigrants. So that's an example of it. So that was your first question. Is there anything that we cannot say politically correct? Well, I can't think of anything. I mean, we defend our values completely. We'll debate them. Some things, I guess, are not very... In our Orthodox synagogues, and I come from an Orthodox synagogue, men and women sit separately. So I guess that's not politically correct. As it happens, there's a great debate going on within the Orthodox community at the moment about the role of women. By the way, the same debate's going on in Muslim communities. I've had some fascinating... and I think your other question was, yes, about Muslims. What do I mentioned it earlier. I mentioned it in this way. The typical story is that a Jewish community would start off very poor, but within our community there's a very strong Jewish ethic of self-help, and that includes having a fund for people who've fallen on hard times. And in fact, in Jewish law, it is a greater priority to look after the poor than to build a synagogue. So people count more than bricks and mortar. So a typical Jewish community would establish a fund, and sooner or later they would say, who's vulnerable in our society? Oh, the elderly. We need to build an old age home. And someone they'd have to go out and fundraise. So someone who'd be modestly successful in business would endow a room. 10 years down the road, that person would endow a wing. And gradually, that sort of charitable endeavour would be rewarded by, if it was ever found out about, by the government. They get an OBE. And if they carried on doing it and people became more successful, they could get other honours and become lords, whatever it was. And I say to my Muslim friends, that's how you do it. There is simply I don't know any other reason why Jews have whatever influence we're supposed to have. By the way, I don't think we have nearly as much as attributed to us. I think we try to be a part of society and contribute to it. And Jews in Britain, just like Jews in, I think, pretty much every country, have distinguished themselves with fantastic contributions by some very talented people in the arts, in the sciences, in medicine, in law, in the media. And we are... that's just axiomatic. Religious Jews, mostly not religious Jews, but still very Jewish Jews. And that is how, and that's how I say to my Muslim friends, put your back into society, work for the greater good of society. We have one saying which came from Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet of the exile, where Jews for the first time lost their self-determination when the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. And Jeremiah witnessed it, and he understood. Jewish people were deported to Babylon, 800 miles away, what's currently Iraq. And he said, and it was absolutely shattering statement at the time, pray for the welfare of the place where you live, because in its welfare lies your welfare. And I believe that message is as true 2,500 years on as it was when he wrote it, for any minority in any society.
Final question.
Since you mentioned the BBC, how has traditional media like the BBC treated anti-Semitism, Israel, BDS, so on?
Anti-Semitism, I think they've reported it absolutely accurately. And I say this about the media generally. If we look at the front page of the Times today and the front page of the Times yesterday, you will find the anti-Semitism story. It's a story, and I've had, obviously, interviews with some of Britain's most cynical, experienced reporters, and they've all said to me, we just can't believe what we're seeing here. You're absolutely, we get it entirely. So I don't have any qualms at all about the British press's, the media's ability to reflect the events fairly, even if they don't express a view on them, which they don't have to. Israel's a different story. And the BBC is by no means the worst or the only offender. A Jewish community is extremely troubled by reporting about Israel, which we regard as extremely one-sided. I could tell you a lot, but here's the funny thing. If you go on the website of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, they have a long-running campaign against the British media, which they regard as being, quotes, in the grip of the Zionist lobby. And their chief problem lies with the BBC. Now, when I say that to Jewish communities in Britain, and I used to go around the country, I'd be greeted with amazement, because the BBC does not enjoy a great reputation in the British Jewish community on its reporting about Israel. So the BBC say, well, you know, we offend the Jewish community and we offend the pro-Palestinian lobby, so we must be doing the right thing. The truth is, I believe, this is a very personal view, I think that in the main, the majority of news reported by the BBC, if you take the whole bandwidth, is broadly accurate. I say that because I ask anyone, take a piece of paper, watch the news for a week, and have one column headed fair and another column headed biased. And I think you might be surprised at the end of the week how much you find a proportion is biased. When it's biased, it's pretty darn badly biased. And I think I recognise when it's biased because immediately my hackles are raised. I'm assuming that my colleagues in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign have the same hackles raised by things that... When you see something that you don't regard as biased, you don't react at all, do you? That was what they should say. That seems fair to us. So you get very excited when you see something that's biased, but I think that hides the fact that so much isn't. Having said that, The Guardian, The Independent, I think have a consistently anti-Israel bias that is discernible. The BBC has had many examples where its disciplinary process has actually accepted bias, although it's a terrible process to go through. And I think that it's real and it's there. On the other hand, you've got other parts of the British media, like the Times, the Telegraph, I think that are much fairer about Israel. Overall, I would say there are some pretty bad patches. And broadly speaking, I think our media is okay. But the bad is very bad. And it makes my community pretty cross as well. And it's not just the British media. I mean, take the New York Times. Need I say more? Yeah.
So, Jonathan, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much for a riveting